So you may recall I made a video of a Senate Estimates Committee hearing held in March in which Senator David Leyonhjelm asked a number of straightforward questions about domestic violence research and statistics that had to be taken on notice because the experts couldn't answer them. Here they are again.
The TNS document states, and I'm going to quote here, there is strong community support for the cessation of extreme violence against women. The significant barrier to achieving this change, however, is low recognition of the heart of the issue and where it begins. This is a clear link between violence towards women and attitudes of disrespect and gender inequality. But there is no citation provided for this clear link, despite the depth of literature on violence and its causes. Can you give a citation for the claim that disrespect and gender inequality is where extreme violence against women begins and is at the heart of the issue?
Senator, I would have to take that on notice.
Okay.
I may be able to get that tonight. I can check, but otherwise I'll have to take that on notice.
On notice is fine, yeah. But while you're at it, can you also give a citation that suggests that poverty, alcoholic abuse and drug abuse are not where extreme violence against women begins and are not at the heart of the issue? I know that's attempting to prove a negative, perhaps, but I'm assuming that you've looked at this fairly thoroughly, and there is some evidence that would suggest that disrespect and gender inequality is at the very least substantially more significant than poverty, alcohol abuse, or drug abuse, and that's referenced.
I can take those on notice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the time I made the original video in April, the experts hadn't replied, even though they'd had 6 weeks since the hearing. But they did eventually reply to the deadline in late April with a somewhat lacklustre response. I obtained the following from the Liberal Democrats media liaison a few weeks ago. So in reply to the senators' questions, they wrote, "While alcohol, substance abuse and poverty can be contributing factors to violence, they are not the causal factors. The relationship alcohol and drug abuse have to domestic, family and sexual abuse is associated with a diminishing impact on a person's ability to control impulses and maintain normal social controls," followed by a bunch of references. So in other words, alcohol can override impulse control and result in violence, or make existing violence even worse. No great surprise there. These contributing influences alone do not explain why most men who use violence against women do not use violence against other people in their lives, for example, their friends and work colleagues. Well, I don't think Leyonhjelm suggested that there wasn't other factors, and I notice you have conveniently dodged the influence of poverty. Now, I took a look at the Mouzos and Mackay study of 2004, and I can't find anything resembling what was asserted above. In fact, on page 3, we find the following. The strongest risk factors for current intimate partner physical violence were associated with aspects of male behaviour. These were drinking habits, gets drunk a couple of times a month or more, general levels of aggression, violent outside the family. So that's interesting. It may not be with colleagues or friends, but I think it qualifies as other people. Perhaps they get in a scrap down at the local pub when they've had a few too many. In fact, on page 59, it notes, males who had been violent towards anyone outside the family, for example in bars or in the workplace, were 6 times more likely to inflict violence on their intimate partner during the past year than males who were not violent outside the family. Also, when it comes to violence against women perpetrated by a non-partner, the biggest category according to Table 14 is the friends, acquaintance, work colleagues category. And the question needs to be asked, how many hours do you spend with your colleagues and with your partner, and how many of them are you either drunk or high on drugs? That's a vital piece of information for making a valid comparison. This suggests underlying socio-economic inequality and discrimination to be reinforcing factors that increase the frequency or severity of violence against women. Well, not based on the information you've given so far. Now you see the footnote there, number 5 links to this study. Alcohol may not cause partner violence, but it seems to make it worse. A cross-national comparison of the relationship between alcohol and severity of partner violence. But the title of the study is a little misleading. This study does not seek to explain the cause of partner violence or debunk the notion that alcohol is a cause. The study just sought to find out whether alcohol made the violence worse, and that's exactly what it found, as the study acknowledges on page 1516. The consistent link between alcohol and partner violence has led to the recognition of alcohol consumption as a risk factor for intimate partner violence. World Health Organization 2009. And then again in the conclusion, the results from this research indicate that alcohol consumption is not simply a risk factor for violence, but it may also serve to potentiate violence when it occurs. Potentiate meaning making it worse. Interestingly, in this study in Australia, both males and females reported almost identical rates of physical aggression by an intimate partner during the previous 2 years. But of course, we're only interested in violence against the women's. Now, late last year, Corinne Barraclough wrote a piece titled, "Don't Blame Men for Domestic Violence, Blame Booze." A major new study released on December 15, completed by researchers from Deakin University School of Psychology, has confirmed the link between alcohol and other drugs and domestic violence. Researchers found heavy binge drinking doubles the risk of family or intimate partner violence. Over 3 years, researchers analysed police data and found those who reported their partners were heavy binge drinkers were nearly 6 times more likely to report those partners had been violent towards them. Lead researcher of the study, Alcohol Drug Involved Family Violence in Australia, Professor Peter Miller, says, heavy drinking was also found to be associated with increased levels of coercive, controlling behaviour, which includes emotional, psychological and physical abuse of a partner. Now, as to the issue of poverty, Barraclough notes, Mary Barry, CEO of Our Watch, recently told a website, being poor does not cause domestic violence. However, Deakin University research states family and domestic violence incidents occurred most often in areas of greatest socio-economic disadvantage in New South Wales, 26%, Tasmania 29%, South Australia 48%, and Victoria 32%. Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education Chief Executive Michael Thorne says ADIVA research findings add further weight to decades of research demonstrating alcohol contributes to incidence and severity of family and domestic violence. Frankly, the evidence that alcohol is a significant risk factor for family violence is irrefutable, and while we have witnessed a continued focus by governments on the need to address family violence over the last 2 years, our political leaders still refuse to recognise the elephant in the room. They fail to acknowledge that alcohol contributes to the incidence and the severity of family and domestic violence. Now, I disagree somewhat with the title of this article, but not with the idea that alcohol is a factor. I don't think you can identify a single cause for violence. You have to talk about factors. So if you have someone that has a history of violence, engages in controlling behaviour, lives in a low socioeconomic area and is often intoxicated, you have 4 factors which raise the likelihood of that person committing domestic violence. Now moving on to the second claim that disrespect and gender inequality are the cause of violence against women. The experts note, Change the Story, a shared framework for the primary prevention of violence against women and their children in Australia, a joint publication by Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, Our Watch and the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation states that there is now consensus in the international research that examining the way in which gender relations are structured is key to understanding violence against women. Studies by the United Nations, European Commission, World Bank and World Health Organization all locate the underlying cause or necessary conditions for violence against women in the social context of gender inequality. So that claim comes from this document, which doesn't actually provide any backing but sends you to another document which is co-authored by Dr. Michael Flood, who has a dubious relationship with the truth when it comes to the representation of statistics about domestic violence, probably because he's a staunch feminist. And I'll leave a link to that down below. Now, in this report, there's a section titled The Root Causes of Violence Against Women, with the key one being gender inequality. In this section, special consideration is given to a recent study in Lancet in 2015 using population data from 44 countries. Now, that should set off alarm bells, because if you're going to lump Australia in with Saudi Arabia or Eritrea and then generalise, you're going to get some shaky conclusions. And the paper's findings admit as much. Quote, The distribution of partner violence is highly uneven, with a prevalence of less than 4% in the past 12 months in many high-income countries compared with at least 40% in some low-income settings. And to get technical about it, for every log increase in GDP per person, the prevalence of partner violence decreases by 5.5%. These findings are robust to quantile and logistic regression and are largely similar in urban and rural samples. And in addition, especially predictive of the geographical distribution of partner violence are norms related to male authority over female behaviour, norms justifying wife-beating, and the extent to which law and practice disadvantage women compared with men in access to land, property, and other productive resources. Gender-related discrimination in family law, including differential rights to child custody, to inherit land and money, and to marry and divorce, also predict levels of partner violence across settings. Now, does that sound like Australia or any other developed country for that matter? And of course, they note that this underpins reports and frameworks put out by the likes of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. And here's Christina Hoff-Summers on one such report from the World Economic Forum in 2015.
The Global Gender Gap Report is a yearly study sponsored by the World Economic Forum. Now, this is a prestigious group that meets in Davos, Switzerland each year. It attracts more than 2,500 of the world's leading figures in business and politics. People like Bill Gates and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they show up. So do celebrities like Bono and Mick Jagger and Angelina Jolie. The purpose of the gathering is admirable, to brainstorm on ways to make the world a better place. And one way the forum hopes to improve the world is to highlight what they call role models of gender equity around the world. Well, since 2006, the forum has produced yearly reports ranking the world's nations on gender equality in key areas such as economic opportunity, political empowerment, health and education. Well, the just released 2015 findings are typical of earlier reports. Rwanda, the Philippines, Nicaragua, they somehow get higher rankings than the United States, Canada, Denmark. Well, journalists, with few exceptions, have been electrified by the gender gap study. Many have praised it for showing just how backwards we really are in the United States. Well, the factual feminist has some concerns about the soundness of the gender gap study. The researchers are well-intentioned, but their study shows a lack of common sense. Now, this is strictly a study of gaps between the sexes. If men and women in nation X are equally illiterate, disenfranchised, and just as likely to die at an earlier age, that all but guarantees a high ranking. No gender gap, no problem. That isn't always true. Gaps favoring women, those are just fine. I mean, if women turn out to be better educated, more likely to vote, less vulnerable to violence, early death, those gaps can help a country in the rankings. Look at Russia. According to the Davos study, Russian women enjoy 11 more healthy years of life than men. Now, that's bad news for Russian men, but it's great for Russia's standing in the study's healthy life expectancy metric. A Davos report that honestly showed the burdens and benefits of men and women around the world, that would be far more useful than this quirky, one-sided study. Now, look at this 2004 chart from the World Health Organization. It shows that men throughout the world are at vastly higher risk of injury and violence. Gender gaps are complicated, but the World Economic Forum disguises that. It gives an oversimplified and distorted picture of what's really going on. There are other troubling features in this study. It doesn't distinguish between societies that are dictatorships and free, and it greatly rewards countries that use gender quotas in allocating political positions. And countries that combine dictators and gender quotas, Cuba, Rwanda, Burundi, they're almost guaranteed to be given role model status in the category of political empowerment. Well, again, this is misleading. Rwanda's 2003 constitution establishes gender quotas for its lower parliament, and women now occupy about 64% of the seats. But that same constitution gives the current president close to absolute power, including the right to dissolve the parliament. The human rights watchdog group Freedom House gives Rwanda failing grades where political rights are concerned. In Mozambique and Burundi, almost everyone, male and female, is in the full-time labor force. Now, that improves their Davos ranking, but is it really a sign of progress, opportunity, or even true equality? These countries are not bastions of gender equity. They're desperately poor, and nearly everybody is forced to work, men and women, and often children too. In wealthy countries like the US and Germany, lots of mothers and some fathers choose to work part-time or leave the workforce when they have children. But that creates gaps, and those gaps, they penalize the United States and Germany on the Davos metrics.
The report then cites numerous statistics in Australia that purport to demonstrate gender inequality. They cite the usual suspects such as the underrepresentation of women in executive roles, in the boardroom, in politics, the wage gap. But of course, pointing out statistical disparities doesn't mean gender inequality. In fact, research that I've cited here before shows the exact opposite. The more free and open a society, such as the often cited Scandinavian countries, the greater the differences between the sexes. Here again is Christina Hoff-Sommers.
Now, this brings me to another serious objection. The study promotes the idea that statistical parity between the sexes is synonymous with justice and well-being. But is that always true? There's a serious body of psychological literature that suggests that as countries get richer and freer, the sexes become less alike. In an earlier Factual Feminist video, I described a study where researchers looked at gender and personality norms in 55 countries. Now, throughout the world, women tend to be more nurturing, risk-averse, and emotionally expressive, while men are more likely to be competitive, risk-taking, and stoical. But the researchers found that personality differences between men and women are the largest and most robust in the more prosperous and advanced industrial societies, like the US and Canada, France, Germany, and so on. How can that be? Well, the authors theorize that prosperity, equality, these bring greater opportunities for self-actualization. Men and women are empowered to be who they truly are. Now, this cross-cultural research, it's far from conclusive, but it's intriguing. And if you think about it, it explains quite a lot. I was recently looking at an Atlantic article about how women are faring in tech. And the author was surprised that Mexico and Turkey have far more women who are coders than those in progressive countries like Belgium and Switzerland. In those countries, women are more likely to go into health, education, humanities. Well, maybe that's because women in wealthy countries have the freedom and opportunity to be whatever they want to be. Well, I urge the World Economic Forum to consider this tantalizing possibility. Gender gaps are not necessarily indicators of injustice or discrimination. In countries like the United States and Norway, they may be evidence of freedom and happiness.
Exactly. And then there are references to gender stereotypes and perceptions of social value, which of course deny agency to women over their own lives, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Now, that's not to dismiss that real legal inequalities and inequality of opportunity do exist in developing countries, but in advanced economies where women have the autonomy to make their own decisions, that kind of inequality just doesn't wash. And as for the old canard of attitudes, as I've mentioned many times before, an extensive study carried out in Australia showed that both males and females were more accepting of violence against men than they are of women. But don't let any of that get in the way of a good narrative. So after taking about 7 weeks to present this reply to the Senator's questions, I have to say this is underwhelming. And I hope Senator Leyonhjelm follows this up, because the whole domestic violence narrative needs to be challenged. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you're feeling extra generous, consider supporting the channel via Patreon. I'll see you next time.